Before MVC3 came along, the only way for us to implement an action filter and plug into the MVC processing pipeline was to define a class that derived from a filter attribute-based class, and then apply this attribute at a controller or action level. In MVC3, action filters no longer need to be attributes. All you need to do is write a class that implements one or more of these interfaces: iActionFilter, iResultFilter, iExceptionFilter, iAuthorizationFilter. This brings up the obvious question of, if a filter is no longer an attribute, then how does the MVC runtime know what controllers and what actions a filter applies to? This is where a filter provider comes into play. So the MVC runtime, when it is going to invoke an action, it's going to check with filter providers that give it a list of action filters that need to be associated with the request. All the providers do is provide the list. It's up to the MVC runtime then to make sure the proper methods are invoked on all those action filters. An iFilter provider has a very simple interface. There's a single method to implement called getFilters. There are going to be multiple filter providers inside of the runtime. So just like view engines, you can have multiple filter providers. The three providers that come with the MVC runtime by default are the global filter provider that will take care of global filters that apply to every action, an attribute filter provider that will find the filters described by attributes on a specific controller or action, and then there's going to be a controller instance provider. You can also plug in your own filter provider, and this is kind of nice because you are responsible for creating the filter. This means you can actually create the filter using your inversion of control container and inject dependencies into your filters. This used to be very difficult before MVC3 came along because it was impossible to have constructor injection with attributed filters. Since we no longer have the constraint of being an attribute, it's much easier to do dependency injection with their filters, as I'm about to demonstrate. Inside of Visual Studio, I've defined a class called MessageFilter, and this implements the iActionFilter interface. That means I need to implement onActionExecuting, which will fire before an action on a controller executes, and onActionExecuted, which would give me a chance to look at the context after an action finishes executing, but before the result starts to execute. If I wanted to manipulate the result, I could also implement the iResultFilter interface. If I wanted to worry about authorization, I'd implement the iAuthorizationFilter interface, and so forth. This particular filter has a dependency on iMessenger, so it needs something that implements that iMessenger interface so that it can use the messenger during onActionExecuting. Also, since this filter does not derive from an attribute-based class, we cannot apply it to a controller using an attribute. We're going to use a custom filter provider. So the messaging filter provider implements the iFilter provider interface. It has that single method that is required called getFilters. Notice your parameters are the controller context and the action descriptor. You can look inside the context and the descriptor to determine what filters you want to yield up and provide for this particular request. With the logic we have here, we'll be returning the message filter to execute on every request. Notice that when we construct an instance of the message filter, we're actually going through iKernel, which is Ninject's container, and that means that Ninject will have the ability to resolve this dependency on iMessenger for us. It knows what an iMessenger is. It's going to be able to construct this filter. The only thing we need to do to put this messaging filter provider into play is to provide it and register it inside of our kernel, so that when the MVC runtime comes to the dependency resolver and says, are there any filter providers, Ninject will happily return our messaging filter provider. At this point, all I need to do is execute the application, and as we try to render the index view, you can see we break inside of onActionExecuting. We can inspect our context inside of here. We can send out messages because we have an SMS messenger. And if you've ever tried to do something similar to this in MVC2 and pulled your hair out, this is going to be a real breath of fresh air.